yeah, hopefully we can go.
All right. So, gentlemen, welcome to the Liberals debate. Sorry we could not record it live, but
I want to take that thing down.
We've decided to be absolute jerks this morning. This is going to be in parliamentary style, which basically means there's going to be a for team and an against team, a 2-on-2. And we're going to start with the for. Now, the topic is, I believe, should China be economically punished for their participation in the COVID-19 pandemic? Now, each individual is going to have 10 minutes. It's just going to be a straight shot monologue, with one exception. They're each going to have four points of information, which they may interrupt during their opposition's diatribe, and they are going to use these points of information to counterbalance the claims being made during that person's argument. So I'm going to start with Liam and work our way counterclockwise. If y'all would mind introducing yourselves and your basic position.
Liam, first speaker. Basic position is against. First speaker against.
All right, Ember.
Ember, first speaker for the motion.
First speaker for the motion.
Yes.
And Chris.
Yes. Second speaker against the motion.
Okay, and Kiza.
Speaking in favor.
All right, and without any further ado, let's go with the first speaker for the motion.
So, for the motion of the fact of, one second again, of should we actually punish China economically for the COVID pandemic, I think that what we have to first outline is the fact of why the fact of why the situation is the way it is, why we are in the mood of, say, punishing China for not only for the COVID, the fact that it is, we believe at the moment is the cause for this COVID problem, but also the fact of why at the moment is not being accountable for it in a sense. So we'll start off in the sense that with China, I believe that, one second. Yeah, the reason the pro side believes that China should be punished for this, I think the best way to start off is actually look at the history of China itself, in the sense that when we come towards the end of the 1980s, when we come to the end of the 1980s, China is starting to look outwards with the death of Chairman Mao and the rest of the gang of four who are Mao's cronies. We now come to the fact of Deng Xiaoping, who was looking to look more outwards towards foreign business, especially due to the fact to coincide with or against Mao's, what's the word for it now? Isolationism, as I might say. Mostly also due to the fact that it was a way to snub the Soviets, as both Mao and Stalin had fallen out in between this time. And one of the reasons, and why this is such a problem for us, in the sense of the fact that at the same time the West, as most corporations and stuff, was looking to find a way of selling off cheaper goods, always in the looking to in the sense of capitalism. And why this is an issue for us now is the fact of when China opened itself up and we put in most investment, the issue is that we put all our eggs into basically one basket. We created the West, in the sense, created a monopoly. China offered its services. It provided the fact that it did not carry the same work ethic or the same responsibilities that the West has towards its own employees, and it also ensured the fact that items will be cheaper, which they are now. While in the 21st century, we now come to the fact of most of our goods, electronic items, so forth, iPhones and stuff, are much cheaper, much more affordable. It's actually left us in kind of a bind, as COVID has proven, because as of this time, most of our production is coming from China. And the reason why that is an issue now is the fact of all the essential items we need, not just, day-to-day items such as boxing and so forth, but items such as PPE gear, ventilators and so forth, they're unavailable because the Chinese nation has them. and the Chinese nation is the only one who can actually primarily produce them. And why this is the biggest issue for us now is the fact that due to the fact that they are able to produce them and so forth, they can actually hold quite a kind of a Damocles sword above our heads. We can't really argue against China because they now actually have such a monopoly in this issue. I can easily quote now at the moment with the fact of due to the fact that China's actually held most of the items, the fact that now that sorry about this, trying to find the link. Yes, so essentially what's happened now at the moment is that China, being able to be the sole producer, they're now, as an act of goodwill at the moment, now sending off items, such as the PPE and such as the ventilators to other nations, as we've seen in the Netherlands, as we've seen with Spain, the UK, Turkey, America, so forth and so forth. The issue that comes with this is also the fact that China, as shown with COVID, is not being shown any accountability for this mess, in a sense. The issue is the fact of every time that the items they sent to us are not only done by the fact of it comes with terms and conditions. I could easily give you the example of the Serbian Prime Minister, who was inclined, and especially in the Netherlands, who all were inclined to show much favour to the Chinese in foreign press, in media, to write articles in journals to show that China was, doing its very well best to support the West, to flagging that, they were in trouble. And basically this whole, kowtowing down to the Chinese regime, especially to the Chinese communist government. The problem is the fact that the items they're giving away are not a sign of goodwill. Not only did it come to terms and conditions, they're also costing us. I don't have the exact figure here, but we've already sent them over some, I think with the UK, some figures, we've already sent them over, it was 150 million. I have to double check that figure, but we've already sent 150 million pounds in terms of payment for these gear. And yet we've already seen in the last few weeks, if anybody's paid attention, which come up in the news, where we're in the Netherlands alone, they've already had to send back 3/4 of their PPE gear and the ventilators due to them not being up to standard. They are either faulty or they're, as in a lot of cases, just falling apart. And I think this is the whole problem now that we're facing, where we are so reliant on a nation just to produce, just key items such as PPE, such as ventilators, that essentially that we are, we can do nothing but constantly kowtow down to them. We're stuck in a situation where, regardless of what we want to do, we always, especially in this time now, we are essentially constantly trying to, going up against the Chinese narrative. We're always encouraged by them to follow it.
Okay, so if I can just interject, what plans are you recommending for the West and the world in general, the USA in particular, to do with China precisely? Like, we know the situation that we're in with China. What do we do about it if we are going to punish them in an economic fashion?
Right, I'll get to this point now. And the other problem now is the fact of, in the hypothetical sense, if we were to actually, God forbid, go to war with them tomorrow, the issue is the fact that they, apart from maybe a sense of America, who might be able to get by, maybe, the rest of the West and the rest of the world, we are highly reliant on China just for the basic needs, for packaging stuff, for food and so forth. It's the case that, in that case, we are at a major disadvantage. I would make a comparison later about the Cold War, but this is like the Cold War all over again, except for this time we've given, we've practically handed most of our assets off to the Chinese, off to the CCP. We are at a major disadvantage. So the first term that this House will propose is the fact of, the first to counteract this would be to, in a sense, bring back, to encourage economic nationalism, in the sense that the immediate, or at least over a period of time, the withdrawal of all businesses and so forth off Chinese shores. That is, I think, the most key goal to go for, because number one, as it's shown for something like a pandemic, it's just totally shown a flaw in the neoliberal idea, the fact of all these open borders. What's simply done is the fact of we've monopolized, we've put everything, all our eggs into one basket. And when something as bad as this, crisis come along, it's left hamstrung. Sorry. And as I reiterate, I do believe that the first course of action is economic nationalism. We bring back all our industries. We ensure that, if we do want to do continue this idea of maybe offshoring factories and so forth, than we do to maybe other competitors, maybe India and so forth, or other nations that are willing. But to avoid the situations we're in now, it has to be the fact that we have to work in a way that not only encourages that we don't cause this kind of problem, but also the fact that China understands that they've screwed up, because as of this moment, if anybody's following the news so forth, they are totally showing no accountability. If anybody's on the WeChats, the Chinese government has encouraged the fact that the viruses came from America, not from
I'm sorry,
itself.
Liam, did you have a point of?
Yes, I was actually about to ask. I'll ask after how you initiate one, but my POI would be. You mentioned that you're worried about China going to war with the U.S. and how we'd be prepared to deal with that. But don't you think that going to war would be the likely outcome if you're gonna piss China off with restricting trade?
Well, my thing back to my suggestion back to you would be, okay, well, at which point do we actually start doing, do anything against China in that sense? I mean, put it this way, as of this moment in time, the world's economy is absolutely fucking crippled at this point. We're going into the depression. China's taking absolutely no accountability for what they've done. And I was actually going to include the rest of my points, the fact of, about talking about China's accountability, the fact of China is a constantly growing imperial power. I could easily refer down to the neo-colonial projects down in Africa, where they're basically acting as shark clones against other nations. I could easily point towards their actions in South China Sea, where they're constantly threatening the sovereignty of Taiwan. I could easily point to their river projects, which are going to be causing massive issues.
Now, that actually concludes the Embers portion of the debate. That was your 10 minutes.
Okay, fair enough.
So I believe next up is Liam
Yeah.
for against
All right.
the motion.
Just gonna be really anal here, but mic check. We're all good.
Yes.
Yeah, you sound good, man.
All right,
You
good.
sound fine.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah,
good. Just
we're
making
good.
sure. All right, I'm gonna start my timer now. All right, thank you. So let's clear up a couple things in this motion quick, okay? So let's accept, for the sake of argument, let's accept that China was at fault. Let's accept that in principle, if we're in an ideological vacuum with no need to worry about feasibility or the impacts of the things that Gov has talked to you about today, let's accept that if these things were not issues, we would accept that China ought to be punished. Let's do that, okay? Because yes, it's true that China screwed up royally. We accept that their handling of COVID was very poor, and that their monopolization of production is not exactly the best thing in the world. But the problem we have with this motion, the problem we have with Gov's case, is the lack of a proper model for how to feasibly achieve many of the goals that they've set out. We have a problem with three areas. One, we have a problem with feasibility. We have a problem with the lack of a clear direction that the government will take us to in actually adequately punishing China in a way that will lead to long-term success and not have any negative impacts, which follows into number two. They also have not addressed how this would naturally benefit the United States. I'll go into a little bit of rebuttal as to why some economic impacts can be quite negative. My partner will as well later on, especially. We're also going to talk about three, the hypocrisy of trying to challenge China on this regard, where while China was by no means innocent and they were the most guilty, they're not the only guilty party here. And to use this as an opportunity to punish them is a tad hypocritical in some regard. Okay, so to go with a little bit of rebuttal quick, let's point out the problems with Gov's case. So economic nationalism. They talked to you today about economic nationalism and how we ought to restrict trade for the purpose of bringing jobs back from overseas to the domestic sphere. The problem with this is that we've tried this before. These are tariffs and protectionist policies. The Smoot-Hawley Act in the 1930s was tried, for example. That actually worsened the Great Depression. My partner will expand upon that later on. But we have a lot of talk nowadays in this populist sphere of politics about things very similar to this, bringing jobs back home and bringing production back home, and challenging the negative ills of globalization. Now, while we accept that globalization is by no means perfect, we would argue that globalization has by and large led to more good than harm, effectively, and that restricting trade and bringing things back to the domestic sphere only restricts the flow, the flow of cheap goods and services that would ultimately hurt consumers, and not to mention the free trade deals that currently exist between China and the rest of the world. These things would be threatened, and this would lead to a significant number of issues relating to the economic growth of all these respective countries, and as well as hurting the Chinese people. This is one of the impacts we'll get into in a second. Ultimately, we'd be cutting off our nose to spite our face, and this is why we would oppose the economic nationalist model the Gov is set up for us. We have significant problems with a restriction of market forces that would lead to increased prices, albeit at with the consequence of maybe a slightly higher quality of goods and services, but more expensive goods and services and fewer of them is ultimately a bad thing. This is why the world tends to favor the free flow of goods and services rather than restricting trade. This is why tariffs tend to be very unpopular among economists. All right, now let's get into the impacts of this motion. So what would happen if we were to restrict trade from China and centralize the creation and sale of goods and services domestically? Well, one, we'd have an increase in poverty for sure. So not only domestically, because you'd have an significant increase in prices. What was once $2 might now be $10, for example, because you'd have to pay people more. And this is a problem if you're going to be implementing this short term and not gradually phasing this in over a period of years, if ever. This is the problem with restricting globalization, because you ultimately do have a reduction in the quality of life of individuals, because they naturally cannot get the goods and services that they hitherto might have been able to get. Not to mention, we also need to point out that too, China's not going to react to this very well. They're not going to be very happy about this. We can cite examples of the Chinese government and their dissatisfaction with this. China Daily reports in a recent article that one of the Chinese ministers, Wang, says that it was just the U.S. of suppressing them and accusing and smearing them of a lot of intentionally causing the outbreak, and also Trump's threats of economic sanction or of economic punishment. This has led to significant tensions between the two countries, and of course, China is an imperial military power, as we will concede that the Gov point. Pulling trade from them is ultimately not going to lead to very much good in this regard. They told you earlier, but what if China were to go to war with us? We wouldn't be in a good position economically, especially with the lack of domestically produced goods. Well, China would almost certainly want to consider some form of military action if we do this, in the form of maybe a Cold War, which might be possible, or even a hot war, which could happen potentially. A Cold War might be more likely. Let's accept a Cold War might be more likely. That would ultimately lead to more trade wars, more infighting, and ultimately these sanctions and these restrictions would ultimately lead to a lot of hurt, especially to the domestic Chinese population. We can look at examples of Iranian and South African sanctions in those respective times. Iranian sanctions after the repeal of the nuclear deal recently, and South African sanctions in the apartheid era. These things, although were meant to help the Iranian people to punish an authoritarian government, respectively, hurting individuals because their livelihoods were crushed because they could not sell their goods and services as easily, and jobs were obviously not as common. Free trade does grow jobs in a way. This is one of the significant issues with Gov's model. We don't disagree necessarily philosophically, but they haven't given us a strong practical case as to why and how they can implement this without significant repercussions. The poor relationship with China and the poor relationship with other countries, as evidenced by previous examples, this does not lead to very much good in restricting trade. So that's the problem with the impact. We hurt a lot of people, and from a utilitarian perspective, this is going to lead to more harm than good, almost certainly. And three, what's the final point? Hypocrisy. I want to go over this briefly. Now, we're not going to say that China or that the other countries are equally to blame for the pandemic as China. We agree that China is more to blame and that they philosophically anyway are at fault and ought to be held accountable. However, not all the deaths from COVID, and even the majority of them, are directly China's fault. All right, not every country, especially most countries, reacted to COVID accordingly. We acted very poorly. For example, as a Canadian, we did not react very quickly to the pandemic. The U.S. didn't as well, especially the Trump administration, with their lack of purchasing of PPEs, despite them having access to them. Despite most governments having access to them, China is not the only supplier of PPEs, contrary to what government has tried to tell you. And so, if we are going to punish China for COVID, ultimately we ought to punish ourselves to a lesser extent because of the harm that we, in a way, have caused our own people because of our lack of action towards addressing COVID. And ultimately, this is why we believe that China, it's unfair to necessarily single out China exclusively. We ought to look at ourselves and do some self-reflection as well. So what have we told you today on the side of opposition? Well, we've told you that it's not, the Gov's case is not feasible. All right, we've explained that the trade mechanisms that they've lined out have not been properly fleshed out. They are very idealistic, but not that feasible. Not to mention the negative impact that these trade deals will have, or the lack of trade will have, on not only the Chinese, but also on Americans, Canadians, and so forth. And we've also explained to you that hypocrisy is a major issue. We believe that Americans need to look at themselves as well as to why this is a problem, not just the Chinese, even though they are mostly, especially at fault more. Proud to oppose.
Okay, and you are right on the dot. Kiza, I think you're up.
Yes. All right, sure thing. So, as speaking to someone before, I would like to bring some context regarding China's rise as an economic powerhouse. If I were to find my link here, China in 1980 had a GDP per capita of, wrong sheet, sorry. Yeah, China's GDP in 1980 was $0.3 trillion. And it's now currently, as of, estimated 2020, although the figures going to go up to 2018, $13.4 trillion. Now, if my maths is not off, that's a rise of about 4,200%, give or take. That's a humongous rise. We go into GDP per capita in China. It was about $300, give or take, in 1980. 2018, it's $9,600. And that's a rise of about, if memory serves, 32 times in space of just under 40 years, which is humongous and incredible. But this is the drawback. This entire problem with China goes all the way back to the Nixon government, where they thought liberating all this free trade, quote unquote free trade. Personally, I find most free trade is not actually free trade; it's subscription trade deals. It gave it gave a lot of economic power to them to allow them to grow at our detriment. And we've effectively, in the politest of context, cuckolded ourselves to China. And now the United States and as well as the rest of the world have created this monster, and a cynic can say, well, you made your bed, now lie in it. But the reality is, this whole situation with COVID has royally exposed the fatal flaws with globalization and as well as free trade and open borders. And now with this concept, a lot of countries are now going to think twice about offshoring industries from now on. And regarding to what Liam said regarding the trade war and about tariffs, Sure, many economists may not be in favor of tariffs. However, what the Trump administration have demonstrated is a push towards economic nationalism is actually, in terms of GDP and GDP per capita, vastly more beneficial than the current neoliberalist free trade model we have today. Because if you look at GDP growth and GDP per capita growth, it has significantly rise more so just in Trump's recent administration than it has done since in the last, I believe, in the last 15 years, which is a humongous thing. And ultimately, the main people who benefit from that is the working class. Now, to go back to history lesson, you look at cities like Detroit in America, 1960. In the 60s, it was the richest country in the world. It had a massive manufacturing industry as well as the music industry. But then come 1970, that was all ripped apart, and now it's known for huge amounts of crime. And that city has never recovered. And it's not just the case in the United States. It's the same thing with the United Kingdom, with places like the Midlands. Places like France have been ripped apart. All these countries, a lot of other Western countries have now, because they've all been offshored into places like China and India, and those countries have never recovered. And people go on about, oh, but GDP, GDP, GDP. Yeah, well, guess what? GDP don't mean jack if your country's going into ridiculous levels of debt, and also your per capita rate's actually going down. And also, since the push for globalization, we've had 3 or 4 major economic recessions within that time. Whereas if you look in the time period prior to that, you had one big economic recession, which was the Great Depression. I would not call that an improvement in economic grounds. And as for people being skeptical about the push towards economic nationalism, well, think of it this way. A nation is only as strong as its weakest component. Similar with military. You're only as fast as your slowest soldier. Now, if you push more economic nationalism, and you could try this with pushing massive tariffs, and the United States, as well as the Western world, has done this in the past. We've done this with Cuba, put a massive trade embargo with them. The Obama administration put massive sanctions on Russia, and that hurt them very badly in the process. If you were to put very high tariffs on China, and then by contrast, pushed very low corporation taxes on the Western world, those big rich business people, like Apple, Samsung, and all that, they're going to think, oh, crud, low taxes and high taxes on things. We're pulling out. They'll pull out completely. Yeah, it's going to hurt the Chinese people, who I do feel sorry for. But ultimately, you've got to break a few eggs to make an omelette. And yes, there is, I agree with Liam, elements of hypocrisy in the United States and the Western world's part regarding the situation. But this was bound to happen, and people were warning about this for 50 years. And sure, many economists out there will disagree with the push for economic nationalism, but then I put to them this question. Do you support the huge amount of debt we've got, the huge amount of spending, the liquidation through fractional reserve banking and quantitative easing, as well as the huge amount of freaking poverty in the host nations? If you don't, economic nationalism will address all those problems far better than they will with free trade. Now, yes, people talk about rising prices. Well, here's the funny thing. There may be a small rise in price, but here's the thing. You save money in terms of trading, like distribution of goods. You make everything in China. That thing's got to go on a cargo ship on a plane to your destination. That gives you a massive choke point. If there's a delay, well, you're screwed. And that adds additional costs. So in reality, the profit margins of businesses, especially in China, is not that big not that big compared to a Western country nowadays. And also, if you were to put aggressive low taxes, those rich companies, because we all know these people don't like paying taxes, they're more likely to come along with, especially with low corporation taxes, because you've got all the money here, all the investment money is going to be here, it's going to stay here. Whereas if it goes to China, it's going to stay in China. And if you look at the state of China, especially compared then, they've just kept building and building and building and building. That's how you rise, is by constantly building stuff. Whereas the Western world, they stood still or regressed. You can't improve by going backwards. You have to keep going forwards and constantly build upon this. And it's not just a question of what's going on now with the current generation, the young generation being shafted. If you want to maintain the civilization, you've got to keep on building upon and make yourself better in terms of your economic model. And not just that. Another thing everyone seems to ignore: we're going through the fourth stage of the Industrial Revolution, where everything's going to go more digitized and more automation. Well, guess what? That's going to bring a lot more economic problems, and therefore economic nationalism will address that burden regarding that question itself. And also with more economic nationalism, there's going to be more jobs to go around for your population, in which case you address the issue of wages.
PLI.
Am I still got time?
All right.
Frank, have I
PLI?
still got time?
Yeah, you've got about
Oh,
2
yeah.
minutes.
All right. So,
But hang on. Liam has a point of information.
yes, Liam. Yeah. Yes, Liam.
You mentioned that these economic nationalist ideas will help with trade, but how do you address the potential tensions that they'll bring up with countries like China?
Well, the thing is that there's always going to be natural tensions with countries. The problem is that if we were just to say, sit back and say, you know what, China, we don't care, just keep on doing what you're doing, they're naturally going to think, oh, we're chickens, we're easy meat, and they're just going to keep on pushing and pushing and pushing again, like a child, like it's almost like a child. You got to treat these corporations and countries sometimes like children. You let them run wild, they'll cause absolute havoc. You make it very clear where to draw the line, and quite often it ends up stopping there and there. And the thing is, people talk about going to war. Has everyone forgotten the United States is the world's most powerful military and could take on the entire world by itself? And ultimately, a war's not good for either side. But sometimes you may have to have that threat of violence in order to kind of sort things out, and then maybe China will bow down and actually become more humble in order to address this point. And also especially, I'm not sure if I'm the youngest person here, but especially my age group, we're basically being shafted due to not just 50 years of neoliberalism, but also the economic recession. It's very bad for us. It's not looking good for us. But with a push for economic there's going to be a lot more hope and a lot more drive to maintain. We'll end up growing as a nation, into economically speaking. Hope that answers your question. Mike,
Fair enough.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So, actually, Kiza's got about 50 seconds left if he wants to give a final statement.
Yeah. Richard Nixon was wrong, and all neoliberalist economics should bow down, except that they were wrong. Is my final statement.
All right, and that brings us down to our final speaker. Which would be Chris.
Yeah, g'day.
So this
Can I begin?
You absolutely may.
Yeah, so there's a couple of points I'd like to really emphasize before I get into the rebuttal and emphasizing Liam's argument. To begin with, unlike most countries in the world, China has, as Kizzy, is that his name, pointed out, that it wasn't until the mid to late 80s that they really started opening up to the rest of the world. They know what it's like to be self-reliant. They have been for a long time. Sure, it was pretty rough for them, and it was only when they opened up that their living conditions really began to improve. But self-reliance is not only a cultural thing, it's a practical, ingrained thing that they've been dealing with for a very long time. They're quite self-reliant even now. They've got the largest domestic market for any goods in the world. So as long as they can keep producing, which they've got the capacity to do, they don't even have to really worry too much about selling overseas. Look at their media industry. They don't even really bother to push out movies globally, except in some moderately rare circumstances. They're the producer of basically the whole world. I mean, as Liam pointed out, there are other countries producing PPE and face masks and any product you can think of. But any production going on in another country is duplicated in China, often with IP issues and all of that, which is just another example of how they're used to being self-reliant. They can feed themselves, which is actually a really big issue when you're thinking about global trade and the consequences of dealing with tariffs to actually take punitive actions against a country. They also have a pretty large technology sector. They don't need to import stuff. It's just more of a luxury more than anything else. I mean, they make their own. They've got an entire vehicle industry. Any industry that exists outside of China has got its own mirrored version. Usually the quality is lower, but they have it. And when you couple that with their ingrained self-reliance, it's quite difficult to think about how you can actually punish them. And really, if China can take on the rest of the world, why would you put them to that test? I mean, my opposition has spoken about tentative military action and stuff like that, which is frankly not even really worth talking about, because like, what can the rest of the world do against China apart from stop their trade and what threatens some military action, but no real punitive measures can be taken against them. So what I'd like to now point out is there's a reasonably good comparison we can make that can kind of illustrate some of the situations when it comes to apportioning blame and dealing with it. And I think it shows an alternative method that we can take. If you look at the global financial crisis, you've got, it's a mirror image, so to speak. The initial issue with the subprime mortgages was mainly due to not enough regulation and lack of oversight at a local level. Bad communication exacerbated this, and the problem grew from what was purely a United States issue, and we could easily apportion blame to them there, but that hasn't been done, and that's all right. But it also shows the issue of how fast actions are taken at a national level. The countries that suffered the most are the ones who tried to leave it to the market as much as possible or tried to lock people out. And the countries that survived are the ones where the government took quick action. So to punish China for the COVID crisis while ignoring the far more blatant lax standards that lead directly to the GFC is rather hypocritical. Now, a second point, as Liam mentioned, is the impracticality of trying to take any punitive measures. And I think tariffs are really the only kind of punitive measure that can be taken. Since the 80s, give or take, mid 80s there or so, we've been gradually from the West sending all of our sort of low-level labor over to China, apart from the production of food and a few other specific things. And they've built up an enormous amount of infrastructure around that, because the supply chain is not a simple thing. It requires, in most cases, a raw input, then multiple transformations of that raw input to even get to the stage where something is produced from it. Even with food, you take a carrot that's grown somewhere, it might be transported halfway around the country before it's even packaged. And so when you take into account the enormous supply chain, and it's very complex now in the world that we have today, even at a national level, it would take, if the West were to punish China, to take punitive actions that in real terms reduce the amount of imports we have from China, how are we going to replace that? Even if we were to act now, the local people, and apart from China and Russia, if we're really going to think about it, in the Western world, we live in democracies, right? So are people willing to suffer an enormous drop in living standards just for a political action? I don't think so. Maybe in the short term, 1 to 2 election cycles, but it could take 20 to 50 years to replace the infrastructure that we've lost and sent overseas. And I don't think it's practical at any level for any government to sustain that sort of change in their economy at the behest of the electorate. I just don't think it's practical. The negative impact that we would have to suffer would be utterly enormous. We live in a globalized model, and China is one of the largest markets in the world, and the damage would be catastrophic. If you take Australia, I'm using that example because that's where I live, we get 1.3 million tourists from China each year spending money. I couldn't manage to get a percentage figure on how much that represents, but that's an enormous amount of people. And the damage done, if we were to lose all of that spending money just in the tourism sector, would be absolutely catastrophic. It's the same with the education sector. Most universities really rely on international students paying top dollar to come here, and a lot of those students, a lot of them, we've all been to uni, we've all seen how many Chinese people go there. They're paying for our cheap education. Restricting trade from China would affect every single quality of life index that we can imagine. And it's the countries that are exporting, so Canada, America, and Australia, where we're exporting our raw goods and we're sending it over to China so that it can be transformed into something. So we're not paying the low wages from, smelting iron and other kinds of processing that goes on. And then we're getting the more refined goods coming back. Now, if we were to restrict that, that would be a very, very large portion of our population would suddenly be out of work, and there would be no money coming back. The damage is catastrophic. In Australia with the GFC, it was purely our exporting of iron that kept us alive. Now, I'd like to deal with hypocrisy, right? So both Ember and Kizza have basically been arguing that China shouldn't have their own industrial revolution, which is really what it is if you think about it. They're saying that China shouldn't get the benefit of the West exporting the low-cost jobs to China. They're essentially saying that we cut them off and then China will not be able to develop in the way that every country has. Look at England in the late 1700s. Suddenly they're pretty much destroying their country in the process, with devastating the farming communities who were brought in to man the factories, and a lot of damage was done, but it was what brought the wealth to England. And it's the same with India, Australia, America. All of these countries had to go through an industrialization period, and that's what China's going through at the moment. And if we cut them off, we lose all of our factories, we lose our cheap labor. We don't get our cheap goods. And really what my opposition are arguing is an attack on neoliberalism and a return to protectionism. And that's got nothing to do with China or anything else. The COVID crisis is simply an excuse for it to happen, from what I'm hearing. Now, Ember brought up how in the mid-1980s, China opened up and we started sending all of our work there for the cheap labor so we could capitalize on it, so we could get the benefits of neoliberalism in the globalized world when China opens up. Now, that obviously weakened our infrastructure, and that brings us to the problem we're in now. Okay. However, if we were to suddenly stop that model and cut that off, all we're doing is pushing China further back, which is, instead of bringing them out of the industrializing sort of period, we're pushing them back further. So another country going through a neoliberal period will exploit it again. We're not dealing with the problem at all.
That's time.
Yep.
So.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Yeah.
That's all right.
You took 10 minutes. So that's it. I was surprised we didn't have more interruptions, more points of information.